In our first project, we talked about typography as expression, but to be a full and well-rounded typographer, you have to also get into typography as craft, typography as something that delivers information to a reader, whether for entertainment or other purposes. And I'll be asking you to create 3 different reading experiences. And the first one is a book. And I've got the 3 most standard types of books here that are composed of long texts. We have the hardcover at the bottom, or as they're called in the trade, a case-bound book. We have a trade paperback. These are often about the same size as a hardcover book and are often printed from the same plates, but the only difference is that they're bound differently with a soft cover or perfect binding, as it's called in the trade. And it's basically just a slab of glue that is holding all those pages to the binding. And that's why sometimes that glue binding will start to fail with older books, and you'll see pages falling out of books occasionally. And then you have what's called a mass market book, or sometimes just called a pocket book. These are intended to be printed as cheaply as possible in huge quantities. They have cheap paper, and they are also have the hard spine or the perfect spine binding. Now, when you open up a book like this one, you see a bunch of text. You probably don't think too much about that text or whether it varies or whether it's different book to book, but it is different, and it does provide, based on the type of book it is, a different kind of reading experience. And we'll be talking in the coming weeks about different kinds of reading experiences. So looking just at this first one, this is the sort of book that is intended to be read in bed, on a train, in your living room. The size is partly because it's portable, partly so that you can move it around. And then depending on how that book is designed, it's going to have various niceties or lack thereof. So I have here a book that I think is a fairly good example of interior design. Now, if we go back, you can see that it has sides that accommodate the thumbs, and a designer would in fact call those thumb spaces, and that's nice because you don't have to cover up the text with your thumb, and it creates a nicer reading experience. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that there are a bunch of decisions the designer made that are what I would call, in this case, pleasing and compatible. In that if you look at the space between lines of text, it's fairly open, not too tight. If you look at the indents of the paragraphs, those are also fairly big to match the margins. And it has fairly generous margins around the text. So all of these decisions, the size of the type, the margins, the amount of white space, the openness of the text, these are decisions that go together, that they're kind of compatible. I sometimes refer to this as all of the voices in the choir kind of singing in key with each other. All those decisions are compatible. And now here I have an example of a pocketbook or a mass market textbook. And in this case, and a lot of times different publishing houses will do these all the same regardless of the content. But in this case, I would say the decisions are just a little bit less compatible with one another. We have all this space at the top and the bottom of the page, but fairly tight and dense text. And it seems like the voices in that choir are just not singing quite as perfectly as the voices in the choir of the first book we looked at. And of course, with that little book, the thumbs were covering the text. And so one of the things about reading a less expensive book is that you often have to exert a fair amount of force to hold it open, and you have to move your thumbs all the time to read the part of the text that your thumbs are blocking. It's like a less pleasant reading experience, but it's also maybe a more portable one because it just fits that little book fits in your pocket or your purse or whatever, or your backpack just a little bit more easily. Part of the reason these books are the size and the way they are is for the portability, so you can carry them with you. Now let's just look at a couple of other examples. I think this is also kind of a nice book where it doesn't have margins quite as generous as the other one, but it's nice, open, breathable text. This one, it's a subtle thing. Let's zoom in on it. This is a fairly dense book. If we zoom back, it's a fair amount of text. And one of the things, if you imagine that you took a out of focus picture of one of this book, you would reduce this body of text to to a gray, if you just blurred it out. And that gray is what typographers talk about as typographical color. They don't mean red or blue, they mean the evenness of the tone. And so this has a relatively good cover. I would say it's a little bit, the margins are a little bit smaller, but really it's okay, except the one thing that I think is out of alignment here is it has really big indents and relatively tight lead. And so to me, these sorts of empty spaces are a distraction. They're something that becomes an element on the page. This book has almost as big indents, but because it's more open, because it's more empty, more space between lines, wider leading, the openness seems compatible with that. Here, it just seems like a sort of just out of step decision with the rest of this book. And before you, and that's back to our original, and here's another one with a chapter opener. And by the way, for this part of the project, you can do just 2 pages of text, or you can do 1 page of complete page of text and a chapter opener. And by the way, your text does not have to be from the actual book you're designing, but it should be readable English, because one of the things we'll be evaluating is readability. And if the text is just gibberish, it's really hard to tell whether, if it was English, would it be readable. But just any real text is fine for this. Just bear in mind, and it's really easy to sort of design the text you're working with. So I've had people pick Alice in Wonderland and then do it as a textbook, and then all of a sudden the textbook is about Alice in Wonderland. And Alice in Wonderland is just not a textbook. You have to sort of divorce yourself from the text unless you're using the actual text you're working with. Here, another type of reading experience is the textbook, and these tend to be larger than trade paper or paperbacks or hardcovers, and they tend to be bigger because they often have to accommodate illustration, and they often have to accommodate things like sidebars, and they often have to have all that, so they become heavier, as you well know, lugging them around campus, and they also are bigger, but one of the things they can do that not every paperback can do is they can lie flat. They're meant to lie flat so that you can read them at a desk, is sort of the reading experience they're designed for. And they also often have some space, not always. And in some cases, that's to accommodate notes. So if we look at this one, this is what you'd call asymmetrical layout. The text is on the left, or on the right-hand side rather, on both pages. Though most magazines are symmetrical, the white space will be at the outside of the page. The text, as with the other kind of book, can vary quite a bit in size. So if we zoom in on these 3 pages, we see 3 very different sizes and approaches to text. Like the trade books, I didn't talk about that then, but there's often some information at the top and the bottom, whether it's just a page number or the chapter name. A novel tends to have the author's name on one side and the book's name on the other, although textbook often has more information about that chapter or the topic of that page. Textbooks often also have what are called subheads and points of entry. So this would be an example of a subhead. There's a break in the text, and we come to a subhead, and it tells us what we're going to follow. And that is, a lot of magazines have those as well, but for textbook, it's pretty critical because you are often looking for information that you read before because you're studying for a test, or you need to find it again for a paper you're writing or whatever it is. It breaks it down. It also often, though not always, has a bigger margin for note-taking. So we have this rather old-fashioned book, but all of this space could be used for taking notes or putting information that help you find things later. And this has a couple of levels of subhead, a big subhead and a smaller one. Not my favorite typeface for those, but it shows you. And that one has a lot of note space. And here's another one with two columns of text, and you'll notice that that is also true of all of these except for this one, which has the fairly large space, but almost all of these are 2 columns, and even this column is a relatively narrow column. Studies show that you read most effectively in gulps of like 8 to 12 to 14 words or so, and so by breaking it into columns, you keep the lines manageable for something like this. It's just going to be easier to read if it's broken into columns. Some more illustrations. The illustrations often or always have captions. And it is telling these stories, whatever they are, visually. And here's a chapter opener for this one, which has the big number and a header. In this case, it's not lining up the columns. I think that's not best practices. I try to get my columns to always line up at the bottom of the page. But I guess for a textbook, that gives you a little bit of extra room for writing in it. So our final type of reading experience, and you're going to be taking one text and creating 3 different reading experiences, one a trade book, one a textbook, and the textbook should have subheads, and it should have illustration, and it should have captions, all of those things, but the main focus of this is the text type, and I am going to record a video about all the places you can, not all, but many of the places you can control your text font in InDesign. And these pages would normally be created in InDesign. InDesign is the only program that is intended for long documents. InDesign is intended for books and magazines and newspapers and pamphlets and annual reports. It shines best when you're working with multiple page documents. So you'll be doing a spread for both your textbooks, for your textbook, your trade book. The textbook should be, one of the pages should be an article opener, so it has a headline. The textbook could be all text, or you can include a opener if you want to. Now you'll also be doing a website, and in one standard width. And if you read your website on a phone, most sites these days is going to be optimized for that screen. Or if you read on a tablet, it's going to be optimized for that screen. And there's nothing, well, I mean, I would say it's a programming challenge, but there's nothing tied to the exact screen that you're working on where a different website essentially loads. Websites these days are what are called responsive, and they have what are called breakpoints. When a screen goes below a certain point, the page just reconfigures itself. And on your own home computer, you can call up a website And it has to be a responsive one, but most major publications would be responsive at this point. And you can just narrow that window down and you can watch it hit the breakpoints and resize accordingly, and things get rearranged accordingly to the screen you're working on. And you can do whatever standard width of website you want for your third component of this project. They can all have the same text, provided they are real English text. They do not have to be the text, the project you're designing. You could use the text from Wuthering Heights, and you can make it a chemistry textbook, but the subheads, the chapters, the big type, the display type, all has to reflect the function of that particular textbook. So it's a good idea going in to have a topic in mind for that textbook so you don't get distracted by the text you're reading. It can be hard to not design to the text you're reading, and this is not the purpose of that.